Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual space, Common Word and Canadian Mennonite's first bite-sized book club Zoom conversation. We host many book launches, both in person and online, but tonight we wanted to aim for something a little different, hopefully a bit more engaged, more personal, more interactive. This was an idea first posed by Susan Fish, Associate Editor from Canadian Mennonite magazine, with whom I'm grateful to be sharing the leadership of tonight's conversation. And it was an idea we pitched early to April Yamasaki, author of the featured book for tonight, Hope Beyond Our Sorrows. And she readily said yes to this invitation and to try this new format out with us. So we're very appreciative. Here we are. We're so pleased also for your wonderful response, for many screens from across the continent and beyond. Thank you for sharing your time with us, for already engaging the book, for your willingness to participate with April, and most importantly, to be open to discussing ways of learning to live with life-changing loss, the topic of our evening conversation. We trust this will be a safe space for each of us. My name is Arlen. I am the director of Common Word and a National Anabaptist bookstore and resource center jointly operated by Mennonite Church Canada and Canadian Mennonite University. You will meet Susan and April shortly. Tonight, I am zooming in from Treaty 1 territory. Each of you have joined from various sacred places. We acknowledge together that we meet on the ancestral lands of the first peoples of Turtle Island. And we make this acknowledgement in respect for the host peoples who have for millennia stewarded these bioregions and watersheds and continue to love and care for the land and waters. We are grateful to them. We commit ourselves to greater learning and the pursuit of a justice that will lead to reconciliation. This evening will be divided into two parts. The first part, including Susan's question and response time with April, will be recorded and will live on Common Word's website and be available to folks unable to be with us tonight in real time. The second part, when we invite you to engage April directly, will not be recorded for the purpose of keeping this conversation safe and contained to this evening. I have muted each of your mics so that there's no audio interference. Please keep them muted through the evening. When we later ask for questions or comments, please use the chat function or raise your digital hand. And I'll ask you then to unmute your microphone at the appropriate time. November is a special time of remembrance in our church calendar. The larger church has recently marked All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, and many in the Mennonite community will acknowledge Memorial or Eternity Sunday on November 23rd this year, the end of the church year. Together, we remember our loves and our losses, personally and collectively. And we acknowledge we carry our grief and loss with us. When April Yamasaki and her husband Gary married, they were full of dreams, April writes. But after almost 45 years of marriage, those dreams fell apart with the sudden death of April's husband. Now, how could life go on without him? Yet even in the depths of her sorrow, she experienced God's grace and found a new way forward. We welcome April to our conversation tonight. April is a longtime pastor, editor, author, and blog writer, teacher, and spiritual formation mentor. Hope Beyond Our Sorrows is her third book with Herald Press. Welcome, April.
Thanks, Arlen. It's good to be here.
Thank you for writing this personal book, for sharing parts of your grief journey with us, and for being a compassionate companion for all of us who experience loss. It's not a book, however, I'm sure that you were fully prepared or wishing to write. Can you maybe say just a bit about the backstory on how this book came to be?
As I was writing Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, before it even had a title, I mainly thought of it as the book I never wanted to write about the life I never wanted to live. And even now that the book is being released, even now that I'm hearing from readers about how the book has touched them, I still often think of it as the book I never wanted to write about the life I never wanted to live. And yet I'm grateful for the encouragement to share this part of my story and some of what I've learned about grief. And I hope that it does touch people and that offers some comfort and some hope, whatever loss they might be experiencing. It was after my husband's death, even though I had been writing consistently for years and publishing consistently for years, when he died, I felt like I couldn't write. I mean, I couldn't read a whole book. I couldn't even think about writing a whole book. So when I started writing again after his death, it was only short pieces, short blog posts, short devotionals, a sermon, things that could be contained, that didn't require the kind of sustained work that a book would take. But about 13 months after his death, I had the sudden thought, well, maybe I'm ready to start thinking about another book. And it was so fleeting, really, that when a friend of mine asked, are you going to be writing another book? Are you working on anything? I said, oh, no, I'm not working on anything yet. And I wasn't, but I had that thought. And it was just a few weeks after that, that a new editor at Herald Press sent me an email. And she said, I want to congratulate you on the 10th anniversary of Sacred Pauses. It was still in print. It was my first Herald Press book. And then she said, and we're wondering whether you might be ready to write another book. And she had some ideas. So she said, maybe a book on grief, because she had read some of my blog posts sharing bits of my journey. Or she said, maybe a book on burnout, because she had heard me speak about that. And I said to her, whether it's burnout or the loss of a loved one, those are both grief journeys, because when you're going through burnout, for some, it means losing their job, it means losing their health. There's a lot of loss bound up with burnout, a lot of grief. And the same thing when it's the loss of a loved one, a loss of a family member or a close friend, a loss of health. Those are all grief journeys. And I said, what I'm most interested in is the grief and recovery journey, not so much about the point of loss. I'd done some reading, and so I knew kind of the breadth of books available about grief, all the way from really focusing on the point of loss to the recovery. And I knew that I was most interested in the part of recovery. And so because of her encouragement, that's how I started writing Hope Beyond Our Sorrows.
Thank you, April. I welcome Susan Fish to lead a conversation now with you, with April. Susan is the associate editor of Canadian Mennonite, as I said before, and had the vision for an evening like this. And I'm so grateful to be partnering with you and with Canadian Mennonite in this way. Welcome.
Thanks, Arlen, and thanks, April. April and I have just met this evening, but we both feel like we know each other a bit because we have read each other's writing. So, and you may have that same feeling with April, or maybe me, or maybe others on this call too. But April, the person I want to hear a little bit about before we start, I want to bring him into the room. Tell us a bit about Gary. It's been just under 4 years. You talked about 13 months when you were ready to write, but it's been almost 4 years. So when you think of Gary today, what's on the top of your mind when you think of him?
A whole flood of memories and conversations and funny, wonderful things that were part of our relationship. He was brilliant, creative, very kind, although a perfectionist, so he could be hard on himself. Um, in addition to his seminary teaching, one of his pet projects was to create a series of animated videos to teach New Testament Greek. And he had finished those videos. He had students already using them, but perfectionist that he was, he said, I want to revise them one more time. So that was part of who he was. He also loved Canucks hockey, and even more than watching Canucks hockey, he loved hockey statistics and the hockey pool that he ran with friends. And he even wrote articles for an online magazine called The Canuck Way. And his articles were always very in-depth and heavy on statistics.
That's awesome. I love that. Um, in this book, you talk about different stages of grief, and a lot of us would know the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the different stages of grief. And even she, that's not what you're talking about when you talk about stages of grief. But even she said that the way we understand it, it's not sequential, moving from one to another, but it's all sorts of all over the place. And she said, you say in her book, she says that our grief is as individual as our lives. But you describe grief in stages of early, middle, and present grief. Can you tell us, can you unpack that a little bit for us? Tell us a little bit about the difference, your different stages of grief.
Yes, unlike Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages, mine don't come from any kind of in-depth research and interviews with people, which is what her work had been.
Sure.
But it started, I guess, when just over a year after Gary had died, someone had asked me, how did you deal with your grief? And it was a question in the past tense. How did you deal with it? And I immediately translated it in my mind. How are you dealing with grief? Because at that time, I knew for myself that I was still dealing with grief in some way. And so I began to think about my personal stages. And so I thought of that first shock, especially because we had all been expecting that he would recover from the latest complications. He had recovered from the latest complications, and the doctors had been talking about him getting stronger and coming home from the hospital and resuming his chemotherapy. So when he died, it was a great shock, and I felt like as I said, could hardly breathe, could hardly move. And so for me, that early stage of grief was really about attending to the essentials. I mean, I know that I should be eating and drinking, at the hospital, even that night when he passed away, the social worker came to the room and she had brought me a paper bag with a sandwich and some yogurt and some bottled water because she wanted to make sure that I had something. So, for me, that early stage, I spent time with people. I spent time by myself. I would go for walks every day, but I also spent some time just lying on the couch, watching my husband's collection of DVDs and, feeling sorry for myself, moping around, crying, listening to music. So all of those things. Some days I would spend 3 hours on the phone because different people would be calling me. And so it was that mix of focusing on the essentials that I needed to do both for myself personally instead of eating and drinking and getting sleep. And then some of the people call it the death work. Some of that actually did need to be done very early on. So I attended to that. But then for me, middle grief was moving beyond that and really attending to more of those things. I think I had 5 different lists, 2 from the social worker, 1 from the funeral home, and a couple of other lists of things to do. So I did, again, kind of what was essential or what I felt like doing, but it was definitely that middle time of going through things that needed to be done, should be done, and then all of the firsts. So his first birthday after his death, our first anniversary after his death, the first Christmas, all of that. I thought, yeah, this is sort of my middle grief. And then present grief, when the person asked me, how did you deal with your grief? I thought, yeah, it's present grief. Sometimes I'm back in early grief, and sometimes I'm in that middle grief, and sometimes I'm going about life and starting to write again and things like that.
One thing I really appreciate is you write the book according to those stages too. Like you take the reader through that, not just in terms of the content, but even just the short chapters at the beginning. When you're in early grief, you said you couldn't read, you couldn't write. And so you acknowledge that by making your chapters short. So the chapter that people had tonight to read is a short chapter. I hope people have read more than that, but it's enough. And it's maybe as much as people can manage. I want to jump to, I always love metaphors, and you talk about grief as being like molasses. And so I'm just wondering, as like, I'm assuming that is a metaphor. And I'm wondering, how is grief like molasses?
It's not original to me. I've actually read that in a number of different places, and I realized that it fit to my understanding of early, middle, and present grief, because my early grief was like that plunge into molasses, not being able to move or breathe. And then the middle grief was that struggle to get unstuck. And then present grief is going ahead with life, but just like molasses tends to cling to us, grief also clings to us. And so for me, that became a good metaphor for understanding grief.
Mm. Mm. Thanks. Another word you use is one that people may or may not know, and it's peregrination. And so I'm curious where you came across that. Is that part of the spiritual direction work you've done? If you can kind of explain what that is and how it's different from pilgrimage, and how it works in this context.
Besides my own writing, I'm currently serving as the editor of Rejoice magazine. It's a daily devotional magazine, comes out quarterly and published by Menno Media, which is the publishing arm of both Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA. And in the course of editing, I read a devotional by one of our writers who is a spiritual director, among other things. And she talks about peregrinatio. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right even, but it's the Latin version of that. It was the first time that I had come across it. But then after that, it seemed like I was seeing it everywhere. And I wanted to anglicize it for the book, since this is also in regular dictionaries, peregrination. But unlike a pilgrimage, well, it's like a pilgrimage in that it's a journey. But when someone goes on pilgrimage, they generally know where they're going. So someone might go on pilgrimage and they'll do the Camino walk, or they will go on pilgrimage to a specific place. But a peregrination, it's a journey too, but it's not with a specific destination in mind. It comes from St. Brendan the Voyager, who, when he went on his peregrination, he traveled all over. He established monasteries in Ireland and Scotland, and traveled, some say, as far as Canada. And when he went on his peregrination, he went with some fellow monks who traveled with him. And at one point, when they were stuck, it was very calm. And as much as they rowed, they couldn't get anywhere. He said to them, well, keep our sails set, because God will be our pilot and God will guide us. And that's a little bit like peregrination. So for me, thinking of grief as a peregrination, I, at least in the early and middle stage, would say I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know how I was going to get there, or who was going to go with me, or any of that. And so a journey with a lot of questions and without a clear destination, for me, that's peregrination.
Hmm. I've heard saying Brendan before, Brendan the Navigator, and the version I heard, it said he set out with no rudder, no sail, and no oars. And he said that God would take them to the place of their resurrection. And that's scary. There's something scary in that, I think, but also liberating. I'm curious, like it talks in First Thessalonians about how we don't grieve as those who have no hope. And hope is in the title of this book. It's baked into this book. And you talk about the Christian view of loss. And you talk about where hope is. But I don't think you're doing the thing that people call spiritual bypassing, where you're saying, oh, it's all good either. So I'm wondering where the hope is, what it does, what it doesn't do for someone who is grieving.
Early on in my pastoral ministry, I went to a seminar that was on ministering to and with people dealing with cancer. And one of the things the leader of the seminar said, he said, there is always hope. So when someone is first diagnosed, the hope might be that there's a cure, that whatever the treatments are, they hope that they will be bearable, that they'll be easy enough to manage. And then if someone should become terminal and they know that the end is near, the hope is not for the cure and not that treatments would be bearable, but the hope might be, I hope my grandson arrives in time so that I can see him before I die. I hope that my families will be well cared for and care for one another when I'm no longer here. And it really stayed with me that there is always hope. So in Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, I end each chapter with a practice that I wasn't sure what to call it, but in the book, it's called a hope practice. That these are small things that we can do, small signposts of hope along the way. And so that's part of it. I mean, the other bigger picture is that in the Christian faith, we hope in God, that God is the one who is always with us. And one of my favorite verses from Lamentations, God's mercies are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. So there is always that kind of hope too, that we can hope in God. And then I have a chapter where I talk about the hope that we have in God to restore all things. Some people understand that as going to heaven when we die, and that's part of it. But it's much more, because the scriptures talk about the time when, beyond time, there will be no more sorrow or sighing or tears. And God will restore everything, all of creation, not just human life, but all of creation, to the wholeness and the peace that was envisioned before the creation of the world. So I think part of the Christian view of loss is that, and what doesn't change, is that we do lose people and things in this life. But the Christian hope is that this life is not all there is, that there is more beyond this. And in that sense, we look forward to the restoration of all things.
But some days that's hard. Like I'm just thinking about the role of lament, because you talk about lament there, and days where despair is probably really close despite the hope. So how do those things, how has that fit together for you, and in those lives that in the reading you've done and the lives of people you've worked with?
I think lament is key. So much of the Psalms show the psalmist lamenting, and we're not always sure what it's about, but there is some kind of distress that moves the psalmist to be angry, to be despairing, to be crying out to God. And sometimes life is like that for us too. So even though we have hope, it can sometimes take the form of lament, a deep lament that questions God. And yet I think even for the person who questions God, there is still faith there, because otherwise they wouldn't be questioning God. They would just be abandoning their faith altogether. So I think lament is an important part. I would say lament is even a hope practice, and I have that in part of the book. But as one counselor who she and her husband had gone through the loss of their stillborn child. And she said, you know, as a therapist, she would say, it's important to lament and to complain and to cry out and to be angry and all of those things. But she said, you know, it's good to put some boundaries around that. And that's why therapy sessions are often only 50 minutes, because you just wear yourself out if you're obsessing over it too much. So she always recommends, after you've had that time of lament and deeply crying out to God, then go and do something physical that takes your mind off of that, because you just can't keep on that same vein, even though it's very important to let yourself do that.
Hmm. Hmm. So the things that people sometimes say in funeral homes and in other places about it was the will of God, or the theology that says God needed another angel or knew best, that kind of thing, rather than letting people grieve. You're saying it is okay to hold that hope, but also to just truly grieve. I'm curious what, like, if anything has changed when you hear of someone who's had a loss. And that, as you say, it could be burnout, it could be loss of a job or loss of a person or a pet even, or something like that. Do you do anything different now, having come through this experience? How do you respond if you hear that someone has had a loss?
I don't know if I exactly do anything differently or respond differently, but it's reinforced for me um, how personal and how individual grief is, and that there's no kind of cookie cutter response that will be helpful or comforting in all situations. I mean, some people would really like a hug, and some people would really not want that. And some people like a house full of people, and others really want to be alone. So early on in my pastoral ministry, because I had no training in pastoral care, so before I knew what I was doing, really, I focused on listening to God and then listening to the person. So sometimes you listen for what people say, and sometimes you listen for what people maybe don't even say, but take the cues from the person who is suffering the loss, rather than thinking, okay, this is what's helpful for me, so that's automatically what I do for everyone. That at least is how I approach it.
Thank you. We are out of time for this, for our conversation here. Thank you so much, April. Thanks for writing this book. Thanks for sharing it with all of us here tonight. And yeah, people can buy the book through CommonWord. You can buy it in the other places that you buy books, but it is a good book, and it's a good gift too, I'd say. So yeah, thank you for the gift of it as well.